Good morning. I'd also like to welcome you to the conference here, the workshop. I'd like to just introduce a little bit. This session is called Filing an Assessment and Refuse to Receive. Our particular topic is called Stability Case Studies. It's a little broader than its Stability Case Studies, because we're also charged with explaining a little bit about the differences for ANDAs and the original ICH Q1 documents. What we're going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about background and the ICH issue. And then Nusie is going to talk about case studies that she's developed for this talk. The idea of differences between the ANDA requirements for stability and the Q1 ICH documents. The short story is there's not much difference. There are some historical reasons that we did not apply ICH to generic products initially. As time went along, some of those reasons disappeared. So back in 2013, 2014, we decided that there was no real reason for the ICH Q1 documents not to apply to generic products. There were a few things that we felt we could keep for generics, simply because of business models and some practices that had developed over the years. The main issue for ANDAs is the differences in the extent of data to be submitted at the time of the original submission. And that is, we dropped the ICH requirements of 12 months down to 6 months. We maintained 3 pilot batches or 2 pilot batches and 1 small batch. We added, based on requests from industry and lots and lots and lots of deficiencies about batch scale, some more specific guidance about what the minimum scale should be for certain dosage forms, specific dosage forms. And we added, excuse me, and we added some specific language about what is a small scale batch, which is not defined in ICH. One thing that's not on the slide, because when I put the slides together, I thought it was actually in the ICH document. But in discussion with some of the other people in our office, they had said, well, it's not explicit. So one of the things that we have said explicitly for ANDAs is that there must be at least 1 batch that's fully packaged in order to comply with the requirements. This has been a requirement in the Office of Generic Drugs since the early 90s, perhaps. So we didn't feel that that was particularly onerous to the industry. That's the difference. All the other stuff that are in the documents, the Q1 documents, apply to ANDAs. I want to talk a little bit about how we think about applications and how we think about our review. An application finds its way into the agency, and since this is a section on refuse to receive issues, we'll just stay with two basic levels. It is a multi-stage process, and the one stage, the preliminary evaluation I have here, preliminary evaluation of content, and that's to determine whether or not the application is substantially complete. We have some discussion about what substantially complete means, but really what that implies is that all the stuff, and I like that, that's a good scientific term, stuff, that needs to be in the application for us to make a decision about the application is there. It says nothing about the adequacy of it. It just says that it's there. If the decision is made that everything that we might need to look at is there, then there is a move in the process toward a detailed evaluation of content. And that is about whether the information that's provided, all that stuff, has the right technical and scientific adequacy to support the application that was presented. To think a little bit about why we need to do that, we have to think about, well, we have to talk about resources for one thing. And we have to talk about what kind of structure we want to set up for our review processes. An ANDA, it's really at heart a proposal to market a generic drug product. And that proposal is to be allowed to put a generic drug in the hands of patients. So we need to be sure that what information is provided is complete and satisfactory. And the language that's used in guidances and in some of the regulations is, and I'll read this, it contains sufficient information to support that statutory and regulatory requirements are met. And sufficient information then says to us that we have enough information to make a substantive review regarding adequacy of the application. Substantive review, you might call assessment, because the outcome of that assessment is whether or not the product can be marketed, whether or not it gets approved. So, so the whole point of moving from the initial evaluation, which is all the stuff there, through the substantive review, the detail, is to say, yes, this application is sufficiently coherent and correct that we can give it to a patient once we approve it. I've called this just application content, but it's really what happens when there's not enough information. So the application is not substantially complete. Therefore, you cannot do a substantive review because you can't do a detailed evaluation of the content. The content isn't there. And in order to make a decision about approvability, you have to be able to evaluate the content. This means, very simply, that you can't make a decision to approve or not approve it because the information that you would normally use for your evaluation is not available to the reviewer. And the agency has a long time ago decided that if there's a possibility that we can't make a decision about whether or not it can be approved, we can't spend the time and resource on the application. We don't want to be editors for applicants. We don't want to be copy readers for applicants, and we don't want to be consultants for applicants. We would expect that when an application comes through the door, that there's every possibility that we can take that, move through our various stages of review or evaluation, and come up with a decision. It's approvable, or here are some things that you need to change, not some things that we need to look at because you didn't send them in. So, so that's some of the rationale behind a refuse to receive. And I'd like to just point out this slide. I like this slide because I think it fits the topic and it fits the way we handle refuse to receive. There's a bridge, and if you follow this bridge all the way around, you'll see that it's a pretty long bridge. If you want to compare this to a product development, a product application path, you could do that. It's a long bridge, and the idea is that you want to be at you start at one end and you come back to the other end in a pretty smooth flow. This bridge, you don't have that flow. This bridge is missing a trestle. You can't get across that trestle without doing something to the bridge. Not fixing the bridge, but continuing to build the bridge. Not every time there's something wrong with a bridge, if you want to think about the bridge as a review and approval path, is there a refuse to receive? If you want to think about some rope strands or something coming along where that gap is, that might get you an information request. Or if you wanted to think about there being several gaps that have some fragmentary road surface there, then that also will get you an information request until you get too many of those. And then you're back to the RTR level. The section that we're in right now is about stability RTRs. And that's because stability is one critical topic that is used in evaluating the adequacy of the application. Excuse me. There's information in the stability topics. That information is used to determine the expiration dating period. And the expiration dating period is what we use to maintain the safety and quality level in the product once it's out into the marketplace. There are several factors that contribute to the adequacy of the stability information. You notice that I said several, and I used factors. The stability profile, which is what we typically think about, which is all the data and the tables that you submit, that's all the tests that you do on the samples that you take for your stability programs, is not all that we need in order to determine whether the stability program itself is adequate. There are several other inputs to our overall decision that on their face may look like they don't have anything to do with whether the stability data passes, so to speak, passes. One of those things is the stability study protocols. And this includes product orientation, their conditions, extent, and product orientation that are part of the protocols. And those are evaluated to determine whether or not the stability program, the stability tests that are done are perhaps the right test, or whether you have enough information Another thing that's even sometimes seems less connected is that we have sample sources. Sample sources. Where did the samples come from that are in the stability program that are being tested? We also include certain manufacturing issues. Might not think manufacturing issues. What does that have to do with my stability test? Well, factors such as the scale of the product being produced, excuse me, give an indication of reproducibility or for what you're building now versus what you're going to be building once you're approved out into the marketplace. Most companies typically scale up and they go from their application into the marketplace. And so if your scale approximates something that you're proposing to do, then we have more confidence that your market product is going to approximate the application product. The reproducibility issues in manufacturing, there's component variability in manufacturing, and these are some of the topics that we need to evaluate when we go into whether or not the data is acceptable. The way the data has been generated is acceptable. I'm not going to list a lot of statutes and regulations and guidances. This is only to tell you that this preliminary evaluation, the one that just says, is all the stuff that's supposed to be there? Our basis for making those decisions comes from both the statutes, the regulations, and the guidances. The statutes are very brief. The regulations are sometimes not specific enough, and that brings us down to the guidance where hopefully you'll find all of the information that you need to find. For our purposes here today, for our purposes about stability, there are really two places. One is the ICH-Q1 documents. They're listed here. They're just called Harmonized Tripartite Guidelines. And the other document is the ANDA Stability Testing Question and Answers document that was put out back in 2014-15. These two documents, particularly the ANDA documents, are also the source of the criteria for much of the stability-based RTR decision-making in the division of filing. So these two places are, as I said, the source for the filing group to make decisions about whether certain information needs to be there and what that information might be composed of. Just want to repeat something that hasn't been said that's been implied in the very early talks this morning. Refuse to receive decision does not involve a discipline-specific evaluation, a detailed discipline-specific evaluation. The RTR is generally based on the absence, without justification, of specific recommended information. So the fact that you've got passing data may or may not mean anything, depending on what other supporting information around the context of the stability values you have. I wanted to, we have an audience question for the online people, and it just says the most frequent reason for stability-related refuse to receive efficiency is. And there are 4 things here. And we'd just like the people at home or at work, if you will, to give us answers to these 4, so as to what you think. While the people online are scurrying around looking through the previous presentation slides, so they have an idea which ones these are. I'd like to just do a very informal, non-quantitative poll here and just see who thinks that A, which is failing to use 2 API lots for each strength, is the number 1 reason. And just go ahead and raise your right or left hand. I'm not counting, and they're recording me and not you, so so that was it. Failing to submit 180 days of stability data is another choice. How many people think that? A few more. Okay, failing to provide, number C is failing to provide stability data for multiple orientations for liquid products without sufficient justification. How many people think that that's probably the biggest one? Wow. So far, we don't seem to have any reasons for stability-related RTRs. So anyhow, number D is failing to submit stability data with 3 time points. Does anybody think that perhaps that is? You got one? Oh, okay. Okay. So what do we see online? We see that pulled out to a lead here. Oh, yeah, that's a pretty good lead. And they win the refrigerator, I guess, is how you'd have to say this, because B is the reason. B was a slight favorite here. There's a fan club back in that corner that seemed to like B more than any other choice here. So okay, we can go back now. I just will. I guess no presentation is complete without a chart or a graph or something. So here's my shot at a chart. But this is stability-related RTR decisions. It's not all of the choices that were just in the audience poll, but it includes a few modifications. The one thing that I'd like to point out to you is that 60% of the RTRs for stability have this problem. This is the answer number B. The other thing I'd like to point out on this chart is some things haven't moved very much over the years. 2015 is when I think I would start saying, okay, we have guidances out there, but they're not, nothing has changed much about the stability RTRs since that time. They've hovered around 30% of all the RTRs for an application. These aren't in no particular order, but they're just the top stability RTR issues, and they mirror a little bit the talk from this morning. And I'll move through these a little quickly here. Failing to use 2 API lots for each strength. Nusie will go into these in some more detail in her case studies in a few minutes. Failing to submit 180 days of data, accelerated and/or long-term, with 3 points, and the intermediate with 2 time points. This 2 or 3 time points, I believe Nusie will also talk about. Failure to provide intermediate data on all 3 batches when intermediate data is necessary. Failing to provide full 6 months, 180 days worth of failed ACC data. Nusie will discuss this a little bit more because it has been a point that's argued again with us over the several years. And failing to provide stability data for multiple orientations for liquid products without sufficient justification. And that's also an issue that can be easily resolved. We have some data recommendations, and that's just, we say recommendations because the more times you tell people things, the more times you hope that they'll remember them. And that's the need for a minimum of 2 API lots, the use of multiple orientations, and the submission of 6 months of accelerated study data, even if there's a failure at any point. I would like to point out that all of these things are in the guidances. Our guidance for ANDIS, ANDIS stability Q&A, and also the OGD RTR guidance. And so with that, I'd like to turn this over to Nusie for her case studies.
All right. Thank you, Frank, for that background. Thank you. So good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Good afternoon and good evening to our virtual audience who are joining us from, I think, 60 countries around the world. Thank you for being up late at night. So before I begin, I just want a quick show of hands. How many of you have received an RTR that was due to a stability-related deficiency? Don't be shy. I know we've issued more than one, and I just see one hand. So anyway, I know this topic keeps people up at night sometimes, receiving an RTR. But don't panic. I'm from the government, and I'm here to help. So by the end of this presentation, you will have at least 10 tools in under your belt, which you can start using today. These 10 tips to hopefully avoid RTRs related to deficiency in the future. Okay, so just follow along. So I'll be sharing with you some actual real examples that we've seen in the Division of Filing Review, and I'll be presenting some major deficiencies that we've actually issued to maybe some of you in the room. So let me go to the first case study that I have for you today. So now you're all familiar with the stability Q&A guidance, right? So just to refresh you, the recommendation is to provide 3 time points for accelerated as well as long-term stability data. And if there's a significant change seen in your stability data, you are expected to provide intermediate stability data. And the recommendation there is to provide at least 2 time points. So a lot of times, based on this minimum 2 time point recommendation for intermediate stability data, a lot of firms will provide us with 0 and 4 month time point, thinking that they've met the minimum recommendation. But actually, we still expect 6 months of minimum intermediate stability data. So if you provide 0 and 4, that's not adequate, it's not acceptable. So at a minimum, we would like to see 0 and 6 month time points for intermediate stability data. So a lot of times you're unable to have that much data at this time of submission because you just don't have enough intermediate stability data because you started it late, right? So we encourage you to place your intermediate stability samples, initiate those studies at the same time as your accelerated and long-term stability studies, so that you will be in a position to have adequate amount of 6 months at least of intermediate data when you're filing the submission. So that will help avoid an RTR. Okay? So the takeaway for this slide, what you can do differently is make sure you have at least 6 months, 0 and 6 month time point for your intermediate studies, right? So the next example I have for you is, we still get a lot of questions on this topic about use of different drug substance lots. So according to the guidance, we would like you to use at least 2 different lots of drug substances in your exhibit batches. Why we want to see this is we want to see what the effect of lot-to-lot variability of your drug substance is on the final drug product stability. So specifically, we want you to use, for example, drug substance lot A in your exhibit batch 1, drug substance lot B in your exhibit batch 2. And for exhibit batch 3, it's totally up to you. You can repeat drug substance lot A, you can use any combination of drug substance lots that you have on hand. So exhibit batch 3 is totally up to you. So just 1 and 2, at least 2 exhibit batches should have discrete drug substance lots, right? So one important concept to remember here is after you receive the drug substance lot from the API supplier, you should not be blending these lots in-house and renaming them to any other lot number or name, right? So only the drug substance or API supplier is supposed to use a blended or validated blending method to blend their lots before they supply it to you. So that's an important concept. And the other thing I'd like to point out here is that this requirement for at least using 2 API or drug substance lots goes for every strength of your exhibit batch in case of multi-strength drug products. Okay? And sometimes we see that some strengths are missing the complete data. So again, takeaway for this slide is to remember to use at least 2 drug substance lots. So this is a new table that's not in the guidance. And this basically just identifies what drug substance lots you used so that it's very clear to us that you did in fact use a minimum of 2 drug substance lots. And it tells us which lot went into what finished drug product, and also lays out the fact that you did use, for a multi-strength drug product, you do have 3 exhibit batches per strength and so on and so forth. So it would make really make it easy for the filing reviewer. It'll save time. And this is, of course, by no means mandatory that you provide the data in this reporting format. And it hasn't been shared before, so you might want to make a note of it and use it as part of your originals and a submission. Basically tell us what the specific batch numbers are and how you met the requirement for minimum 2 API lots. So this next one is an interesting case study and is actually one of the top reasons for RTR related to stability deficiencies. Now, you know that we still receive a lot of inquiries from the generic industry. And the question to us is, would you accept 24 weeks worth of stability data for 6 months? And you guys know the answer to that, right? So 24, in FDA speak, 24 weeks does not equal 6 months. So we want to account for every day, every week. And moreover, the ICH guidances do not refer to time frames in terms of weeks. They focus on months. So when we say a minimum of 6 months is expected, what we mean is a minimum of 180 consecutive days. So a lot of times, firms end up falling just a little bit short of the 180-day requirement. So that's very important for you to remember. So as given in this example here, the firm, to meet the requirements or the minimum acceptable requirements for data, they should have maybe pulled out their sample on March 20th instead of 5 days prematurely on March 15th. So don't round up any weeks, don't round up anything, just go by the number of days. Okay. So now, just to clarify, pull date here refers to the removal of samples from the storage chamber. I think you know that already. And so hopefully after today, we'll only get 180 days worth of data and we won't get any half a day less or, thank God we don't yet start counting the hours. So you have some leeway. So the next example I have for you is, this is about accelerated minimum amount of accelerated stability data. So, it's very intuitive to you guys that when you see a significant change or failure in your accelerated stability data at any time point, you decide to stop the studies because you want to conserve resources and time, and you just want to switch over to the intermediate stability data, right? But that's where, some companies end up getting an RTR. So our expectation is that even if your stability studies fail for a particular attribute, there is still some valuable information to be gleaned from all the other attributes that did not fail. We still, if you can continue with the failed stability studies, we can still see some trends and help us to understand some product characteristics. So we encourage you to not stop your stability studies upon failure, unless there's a very good reason, unless it's impossible and not feasible to continue. For example, if your suppository melts or your bottle is leaking and it's just, the product is totally destroyed and there's just simply no point in continuing. So this way, if you continue your studies, you'll be able to provide at 6 months or at least as much accelerated stability data as you can, along with your 6 months of intermediate stability data. I know this is a little difficult for some of you to digest, depending on your drug product, but that's basically the expectation for minimum amount of accelerated stability data. This is another interesting case study that we've seen. So this is again pertaining to intermediate stability data. So your accelerated stabilities have failed, and so they have failed for maybe a particular orientation. For instance, your horizontal orientation for a particular batch has failed. So what you do is you still have good data to provide us with for your upright orientation. So you go ahead and provide us with the passing stability data, and to replace the failed horizontal orientation stability table, you just provide us with the intermediate stability data instead, hoping that it will just supplement and replace the failed stability data table. But that again is considered not acceptable or incomplete, because anytime your accelerated stability data fails for any particular strength, any particular batch, any particular orientation, we expect you to provide us with comprehensive intermediate stability data. So all 3 exhibit batches, all strengths in the final container closure system. So that's the minimum expectation here. So I know it's intuitive and you'll be inclined to think that, hey, good data will replace one piece of the bad data, but we just need you to repeat everything and provide us with all the data. So more data, if you're ever in doubt with the FDA, more data is always good. So Hope it's clear to you. If not, we can talk some more. You guys may be familiar with the statement at the beginning of any guidance, especially the stability guidance, which states that you're welcome to use any other alternate approaches other than that listed in the guidance, as long as you specify how it meets applicable statutes and regulations. So is the case for a stability topic. You can, if you are including another, one option is if you want us to consider an alternate methodology in support of your application, is to provide a justification. And I'll go over some examples of what that justification might look like. Now, I want to emphasize here that the justification should be clearly identified in the relevant section of the ANDA. So for a stability related deviation from the recommendation, 3.2.P.8.1 is the relevant section that you'll identify the deviation and also clearly explain how the alternate approach meets applicable regulations. And this is needed at the time of filing. So if it's not there at the time of filing, any good justification, even if it's a good justification, your application will be returned if we can't see that justification for why you have, a little bit less data or something else. The other approach, you already may be aware of this avenue, is to submit a response to a control correspondence that has successfully accepted your proposal for an alternate methodology. So want to mention that this route of using a response to a controlled correspondence should only be used if you have a very sound rationale for deviating from the recommendations and the guidance. So let me provide some specific examples of justifications that have successfully been used and seen at the Division of Filing Review. So sometimes an applicant will come in and they will want to submit real-time stability data. For example, 24-month stability data and request an expiration period of 24 months. And sometimes you can even, if you want to request for a shorter expiration date, go ahead and 12-month, 18-month, and then provide the appropriate 18 months of real-time stability data. And this has been acceptable in the past. The only caveat here is that we're talking here about filing review. So for the application to come into the door, this is sometimes okay, especially for a very stable solid oral dosage form. There are exceptions to this. So for liquid that has to be stored under refrigerated conditions, we want to see the short-term excursions, and we want to see how it performs during shipping and transport. So for liquids under refrigerated conditions, we will need to see some accelerated data. As much as you can provide, 6 months would be ideal. So during review, again, any reviewer might request for 180 days of worth of accelerated data or some other amount. So remember, this is just for filing. You can get the application into the door with just real-time data. The final case study for today is the one where the applicant, as I mentioned before, you need to provide 6 months of data. Even if the accelerated studies have failed, we need to see all the data, 6 months worth. So if the applicant is really genuinely unable to continue with the studies, for example, for a melted suppository or a leaky bottle or a melting capsule, they can provide photographic evidence of the failure of the product, and along with the justification and explanation why they could not continue with the studies and could not provide us with the 6 month worth of data. And that again has been found to be acceptable in the past. Just that without an explanation, without a justification, it's hard for us to see why there's a lack of complete data. So that's another thing you can do, is provide the evidence photographic and be creative when you do provide your justification. Convince us. We are reasonable folks. So, okay. Additional recommendations to avoid some commonly seen minor deficiencies that could derail your application. You may have done all the work and have all the data, but due to typos that creep in, pull dates, start dates, we may not see what you see, that we need. I think my time's almost up. They're trying to hint, but this is the last slide. So make sure you have the accurate dates so we can clearly see that you did meet the minimum 180-day requirement. Make sure you don't have duplicate data, and sometimes you have duplicate stability tables and then the main stability table is missing. Verify that every batch has been accounted for, all the batch numbers are there, and check for consistency between your exhibit batch manufacturing record and your stability data tables. I think different people or different departments are responsible for each of these sections. Just talk to each other and make sure there's consistency in all the dates. So that said, finally, do follow the recommendations in the RTR guidance as well as the stability guidance. And we're working on updating some of the recommendations for you. And hopefully you'll see something real soon. Finally, I hope this has been somewhat useful to you, especially to those who are calling us at all hours online. And I look forward to answering your questions during the panel discussion. Thank you so much for your attention.